Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's moderated discussion, Immigration Open or Closed. My name is Michael Gonzalez, and I am the Interim Director for the Institute of American Constitutional Thought, founded by the Ohio State Legislature just last year to provide teaching, research, and public constitutional and civic order. A key part of our mission as established by the state of Ohio is to support the University of Toledo's efforts in civic education. However, we also have been tasked with promoting civic learning and public discussions on key issues for the broader area of Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. We invite you to join our email list for more information on our future events, our courses, and other opportunities that we'll be providing to help revive our civic life in polarized times. The ability to deliberate together about controversial issues with civility, insight, and serious thought is fundamental to our political order. I'm grateful to you for coming out tonight to listen to two alternative views on immigration. I also want to express my gratitude to our two discussants and to the Institute's faculty and staff who made this event possible, especially our moderator, Professor Kevin Vallier, as well as Professor Debbie O'Malley and our media partner, Greg Schluter, and his assistants. Professor Kevin Vallier will moderate tonight's discussion. Professor Vallier is the senior research faculty member within the Institute, where he conducts research in trust and polarization, public reason, religion and politics, and economic justice. He also teaches a course on American conservatism for the Institute and will be offering a course on American liberalism in fall 2025. Professor Vallier received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Arizona. He previously held an appointment at Bowling Green State University, where he directed the philosophy, politics, economics, and law program. He's published, I think, at least 4 books. Most recently, All the Kingdoms of the World on radical religious alternatives to liberalism, as well as multiple edited volumes, over 70 referee journal articles, book chapters, policy papers, and book reviews. In short, his achievements as a scholar and thinker are striking and exceptional, and we are very fortunate to have him with us. He's an ideal moderator for tonight's discussion, and I now would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Vallier.
Thanks, Michael. I'm blushing. I kind of feel. Michael's been an extraordinary director of the Institute, and I was honored to join, particularly given our mission. Of course, we've just had a presidential election. And one of the 2 biggest issues in that election was immigration. Obviously, we might have had a healthier public discourse on immigration. And tonight, we're going to try to model that. Today, we're not talking about current immigration policy. We're not trying to decide who to elect or anything of that sort. We're asking a prior question. And the central question for tonight, then, is when are immigration restrictions justified? So we're going to see 2 very different views tonight, but that's the kind of question that we wanted to ask, this question at the level of morality, ethics, politics, and questions of justice. Because the thought here would be that when we figure out what we want to do in policy, we need to be sort of clear-headed about how we think about our decisions. So when I selected the speakers for today, I had a number of options. And I thought that people would turn me down rather quickly. But they both accepted on the first try. We've got 2 of the premier scholars on immigration, ethics of immigration, politics of the political philosophy of immigration. We have Ilya Somin, professor of law at George Mason University, the Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at Cato, the author of 6 books, Free to Move, Oxford University Press 2022, and Democracy and Political Ignorance at Stanford University Press in 2013. We also have with us Kit Wellman, professor of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis, author of Debating the Ethics of Immigration, Oxford University Press, 2011. Both scholars have tremendous accomplishments, but we mentioned some of these works because these are the works where they've developed their views on immigration at great length. So tonight is a moderated discussion. There will be a few time controls here for introductory comments. So each Kit and Ilya will present their arguments. There'll be a brief rebuttal, Then we'll move into moderated discussion where I raise questions for them. And then we'll turn it over to you for the larger portion of the time that we have together. And so I'm going to now turn things over to Ilya. That's what I'm going to do.
Thank you to the University of Toledo for sponsoring this event, and for Kevin Valier for his excellent introduction and moderation, and of course to Kit Wellman for what I know will be his thoughtful contribution to the discussion. The position I'm going to defend here tonight is pretty simple. Under the status quo, people who might want to migrate from one country to another, there's a presumption of exclusion. They're only allowed in if the government of the receiving country chooses to give them some kind of special permission. I'm going to suggest that the rule should be the exact opposite. There should be a presumption of freedom of movement that can only be overcome if immigration restrictions are the only way to prevent some great evil that couldn't be prevented otherwise. And I will give you some affirmative reasons for why that should be the case, and then I'll also address some standard objections to freedom of movement across international boundaries. So I think the thing to start off with is that immigration restrictions are severe inhibitions on human freedom. Think of people fleeing war and oppression, such as those fleeing Russia's invasion of Ukraine or other conflicts. Think of people fleeing brutal dictatorships, people fleeing racial, ethnic, or religious oppression, women fleeing patriarchal societies, and so forth. Immigration restrictions massively restrict the freedom of all of those people to escape the terrible conditions and the oppression they find themselves in. They also restrict just ordinary human freedom for migrants of every conceivable type. They restrict economic freedom. These people, many of them are trapped in poverty for their whole lives because they cannot seek opportunity in wealthier societies. They restrict their freedom to engage in social interactions and so on. It's very clear, I think, how immigration restrictions severely undermine the freedom of potential migrants, but it's often forgotten that they also severely restrict the liberty of native-born citizens of receiving countries as well. Thanks to immigration restrictions, those people are barred from engaging in economic and social transactions with potential migrants who could otherwise provide them with a wide range of opportunities, the products they make, the innovations they produce, social interactions, and so on. Moreover, the machinery of exclusion that tries to keep out migrants also severely affects native-born citizens. When we have large-scale deportations, like the kind we are likely to have under the next administration, but even the kind we have under more liberal administrations, and almost inevitably many native-born citizens and other citizens get swept into the machinery of detention. Thousands of people every year are detained in this way. Others are affected by the racial profiling that's almost inevitable with immigration restrictions and the like. So there are many threats to the civil liberties of natives, and the more severe the immigration restrictions, the more people you try to keep out, the more significant the restriction on the liberty of natives as well. Finally, I would note that immigration restrictions are a severe restriction on the freedom of political choice. It blocks millions of people from being able to choose what government they want to live under. Now, you might say, well, we can do that through democratic elections, and democracy is certainly valuable, but in a democratic election, the chance that your vote will actually influence the outcome is infinitesimally small. About 1 in 60 million in an American presidential election like the one we just had, and in other situations it might be a little bit higher, but still it's not much of freedom of choice if all you have is a 1 in 60 million chance. By contrast, if you're allowed to vote with your feet through international migration, you have a much higher chance of actually being able to affect what government policies you're going to live under. And I would add, for the 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's population that lives under dictatorships, they don't even have that 1 in 60 million chance. Their only chance of exercising meaningful political choice of any kind is through voting with your feet through international migration. There are also large economic gains that can be had to breaking down barriers to international migration. Indeed, restriction immigration is probably the largest form of government intervention in the economy that we have in the United States and other liberal democracies, and it has an enormous impact in lowering economic performance. Economists estimate that if we had free migration throughout the world, we could double world GDP. That is, the world's economy would be about twice as productive as it currently is. That's because there are many millions of people trapped in oppressive, corrupt, and otherwise flawed governments where no matter how smart they are, how hardworking, they have little or no chance of ever escaping poverty. If more of those people were allowed to migrate, they could almost immediately be much more productive, and over time they could also build up their skills more, which is usually more possible in freer and wealthier countries than in their countries of origin. In addition, immigrants disproportionately contribute to scientific development and other kinds of innovation, and that also boosts economic growth and well-being, and it literally saves lives. Many of the great medical innovations of the 20th century and before, and more recently, were developed by immigrants from poor nations to wealthier ones like the United States. We have literally saved millions of lives through those immigrants we allowed in. If we had fewer barriers, we could have saved hundreds of thousands or millions more, and if in the future we learn from our past mistakes, we can do that as well. So immigration restrictions are a matter of life and death for many of the people that are kept out and have to live under oppression, but they're also a matter of life and death for many of us native-born citizens of receiving countries who otherwise were denied the fruits of the innovation that immigration could produce. I would add finally that if you think about how immigration restrictions work, it turns out that they are closely analogous to unjust restrictions of various kinds that we recognize are wrong in a domestic context, such as racial and ethnic segregation. Almost everybody agrees racial and ethnic segregation is unjust. I would ask, why is that? It's because what race you belong to or what ethnic group you belong to, it's not something you can control, and it's a morally arbitrary characteristic. Whether you're black or white or Hispanic or whatnot, it doesn't tell us how good a person you are. It doesn't tell us how much freedom you should be allowed to have. Now, think about how immigration restrictions work. They also restrict people's freedom of movement and where they're allowed to live and work based on who their parents are or where they were born. That pretty obviously, like race or ethnicity, is something you cannot control, and it doesn't tell us how good a person you are or how much freedom you should have. If you want to argue that your race of birth should not restrict where you're allowed to live and work, the same thing is true of your place of birth. Now, there are many objections to international freedom of movement. In my work, I divide them up into two categories. One category is the sort of arguments for a general right to exclude by governments, and another is arguments that say we need to exclude people to prevent particular policy problems or harms. A standard argument for a general right to exclude, one that you see sometimes in some of Kit Wellman's work as well as that of others, is the analogy between a nation and a house or a club. That just as I, as a homeowner, have the right to keep people out and I don't have to have a good reason, so a national government can do so as well, or I can form a club and I and the other club members can keep other people out if we want to. There are many problems with this house and club analogy. I'll just mention one big one. A big one is that if you take it seriously, it has horrific implications, not just for immigrants, but also for native-born citizens. Consider that the owners of a house, they can decide what kind of speech is allowed in the house or what kind of religion can be practiced there. So I could say only conservative speech is allowed or only left-wing speech in my house, and similarly you could have a conservative club or a left-wing club, a Christian club or a Muslim club. So if you analogize the powers of national governments to those of homeowners or private club members, you pretty quickly get a recipe for a totalitarian state, and that alone I think is a justification for rejecting this analogy. In addition, what leads us to think that clubs should have broad autonomy and right to exclude is that those clubs are voluntary organizations, whereas no existing state is truly voluntary in the same way. What you have there is a government claiming authority over an entire vast territory. Virtually never have they gotten the unanimous consent of all the people living there. There are also arguments for the idea that you can exclude because the true owners of a given piece of land are a particular racial or ethnic group. I'm happy to talk about this more in questions. For now, I'll merely say that for the US, this has the implication that Native Americans are the true owners of the land and they can keep out everybody else, which is one reason why you don't often hear this argument in the US, that you do hear it as a justification for immigration restrictions elsewhere. Even if you don't accept a general right to exclude, I don't see the time. But, okay, what?
You want to tell them how much time?
Okay, so give me, I only need 1 more minute. 3 minutes, okay, great. So even if you don't accept the rationale for a general right to exclude, you might say, well, we sometimes need to exclude people to avoid particular types of problems, like immigrants might overburden the welfare state, they might increase the crime rate, all sorts of potentially bad things might happen. In my work, I go through a lot of these kinds of scenarios in detail. I don't have time to go through them all right now, but I will simply outline a general framework for how to deal with these issues. The framework has 3 parts. First, I would ask, how big a problem is this really? In many cases, it turns out that it's not much of a problem or not a problem at all. For example, far from overburdening the welfare state, most immigrants to the United States and other liberal democracies actually contribute more to the public fist than they take out. Just from the immigration increase in the last 3 or 4 years, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that over the next decade, the federal budget deficit will be $1 trillion lower than it otherwise would have been. So this actually turns out to be not that much of a problem. Similarly, far from increasing the crime rate, immigrants, including even illegal immigrants, have a lower crime rate than native-born citizens. However, let's assume that there is a problem, and I admit sometimes there can be. Then I would ask, is there a keyhole solution? A keyhole solution is an approach to mitigating negative side effects of migration without actually excluding people. And it turns out for almost every problem that people can cite, there are actually keyhole solutions. So if immigrants are overburdening the welfare state, an obvious solution, one that we already practice to some extent under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, is to restrict their access to welfare benefits. And there are similar keyhole solutions for many other issues. But let's say there is a problem and there is no keyhole solution, at least not one that's likely to work. Then I would ask you to consider a third issue, which is, remember, the vast increase in wealth that can be had from free migration. Where necessary, we can tap some of that wealth to deal with potential negative side effects. For example, let's say you worry that some native-born citizens, that their wages will be reduced because of competition with immigrants. The economic literature on this subject suggests this is somewhat of an overblown problem. But let's say you're concerned about that. Then an obvious solution is to tap some of the wealth created by migration and use it to subsidize the wages of whatever group of native-born citizens you think are unfairly having their wages reduced. And there are similar ways to tap the wealth created by immigration to address a wide range of other issues. I don't claim that this 3-part approach deals with every single conceivable problem anybody can dream up, but I think it does deal with at least the standard objections that you commonly hear. And even where it doesn't deal with them perfectly, you still have to ask, is the problem that is created, is it really so weighty as to outweigh the enormous benefits of free migration that I outlined earlier, both the moral benefits and also the vast benefits for economic and social and scientific progress. So on that note, I conclude, but I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
All right, and now we will hand things over to Kit Wellman.
So thank you, Kevin. It's my first time to Toledo. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm very grateful to the Institute for inviting me, and it's a real honor to share the stage with Ilya. So we're supposed to have 13 minutes. Oh, the clock's working now. It takes me like 12 minutes to clear my throat, so we'll see what happens here. So I agree with a lot of what Ilya said, and I am not an advocate for hermetically sealing borders. In a lot of cases, I think we'd be a lot better off if we had open borders. But I'm here today because I'm one of the most unapologetic defenders of a legitimate state's right to close borders if it wants to. And so there are three core premises of my argument. The first is, I believe legitimate states have a right to political self-determination. The second is, freedom of association is an integral component of self-determination. So if you don't have the right to freedom of association, there's an important sense in which you're not self-determining. And the third is, freedom of association importantly includes the right not to associate with potential associates if you don't want to. Now, I think the second and third premises are uncontroversial, and I can establish them pretty quickly. So think about this. Imagine if your father chose your marital partner, right? You didn't get to choose whether you got married or to whom you got married. Your father got, in my case, my father's a lot brighter than I, and he might choose a better partner, my life might go better, right? I'm not saying I'd be less happy, but it's clear I wouldn't be there's a very important sense in which I wouldn't be the author of my own life, right? And the reason is because I don't have the freedom of association. That's a component of self-determination if I don't get to choose whether or not and with whom to marry. Okay? So that's the second and third premise. The first premise, admittedly, is more controversial, and that is that legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination. So in my view, a state is legitimate if it performs the requisite political functions. Okay? And I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A, but at a minimum, in order for a state to be legitimate, I think it needs to satisfactorily protect the human rights of its constituents. So I think Somalia, for instance, is not a legitimate state because it's unable to secure the human rights of its constituents. I think that North Korea is not legitimate because it is unwilling to satisfactorily protect the human rights of its constituents. Am I not mic'd up?
Your mic is muted, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Sure. I've got two mics. We don't know which one.
The clock is paused.
We're never going to get out of
I
here.
see the other one, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, you got the other.
That's the other one?
It might be.
All right. So this is going to be perfect because then when you ask me a Q&A, I'll say, well, that was the part I covered when the mics were off.
There you go, try that.
How are we?
There you go.
Good? Okay. Do I need to start again, or were people were able to hear as much as you wanted? Good enough. Okay. So, all right. So I think that neither Somalia, North Korea qualifies as a legitimate state, and I'm not worried about it having a right to political self-determination. But it seems to me something like Norway is a paradigmatically legitimate state because it clearly does a satisfactory job of protecting the human rights of its constituents. Now think about Norway. So in 1905, Norway seceded from Sweden. And imagine Sweden sees the reunification of East and West Germany and says, that's going swimmingly. Why don't we do that, right? And so Sweden reaches out to Norway and says, would you like to reunite? And Norway says, thanks, but no thanks. If Sweden forcibly annexed Norway, right, I think that would wrong the Norwegians. And the reason it would wrong the Norwegians is it would deny the Norwegians the right to political self-determination to which they're entitled, right? The Norwegians, if they would like to reunite with Sweden, fine, but they have the right not to associate with them if they prefer not to. Or think about the European Union. I'm a big fan of the European Union. I think that the European Union would probably be stronger if Norway were a member. So the European Union would love for Norway to join the European Union. Twice the Norwegians have held plebiscites. Twice they've decided as a people that they didn't want to associate with the European Union in that way, and that's their right. And we could go on about maybe advantages and maybe life would be better for the Norwegians, but in my view, because Norway is a legitimate state, it has a right to self-determination, which includes freedom of association. And so if they don't want to associate with the European Union on those terms, the Norwegians don't have to. And I want to say the same thing about prospective immigrants into Norway. If a Swede wants to immigrate to Norway, if Norway wants to include the Swede in its political community, fine, I have no problem with that. But I think it's the Norwegians' right to decide who they want in their political community. And if they want to exclude everybody else, I think they have a right to, just as you have a right to marry no one if you prefer to remain single. Okay? So, and here you might be inclined to say, well, look, there's a difference between Norway and Sweden merging. I agree that that's an important right of freedom of association. Or I agree that if Norway doesn't want to join the European Union, they don't have to. But what's the problem with a few immigrants? It seems like that type of freedom of association isn't important. And I would invite you to think about the University of Toledo, right? So I teach at Washington University. And if Washington University said, hey, let's merge, I suspect you'd be fine with Toledo either accepting or rejecting that, but if they have the right to reject it. Equally, if I'm blown over by my stay here, and I think, boy, it'd be great if one of my sons came here, my son can apply for an admission, right? But my son can't unilaterally join the University of Toledo student body, right, without being invited by Toledo, because the University of Toledo is entitled to exclude my son. Similarly, if I wanted to join the faculty here, I might drop some hints at dinner tonight about how impressed I was by everything here, and it sure would be nice to get a job here. And if they want to offer me a job, fine, but I can't unilaterally join the community here. And that's what I want to say about prospective immigrants, without denying anything that Ilya's saying about the potential benefits, right? So I'm not telling the Norwegians, don't reunite with Sweden. I'm not telling the Norwegians, don't join the European Union or don't include any immigrants. I'm saying it's your right. You get to decide. You're entitled to political self-determination as a legitimate state. Okay, so let me say a couple things. First of all, I do think there's a right, but it's a presumptive right. It's not an absolute right. Self-determination is not the only thing of value. And you can't look at this world and think that we've achieved perfect global distributive justice, right? And you might look, for instance, there are enormous opportunities for people born in Norway and far, far fewer opportunities for people born in Chad. And you might think, it's just not right. What did the Norwegians do in utero to deserve the opportunities where they were born, right? Nothing, right? And so it's just a matter of luck that Norwegians happen to have been born in Norway and Chadians happen to have been born in Chad, right? And then the Chadians want to move to where the opportunities are, and not only is there a line on a map, but there are guns that correspond to that line to keep Chadians and other unwelcome prospective immigrants out. And you might think, Git, you're just fetishizing self-determination if you think that that's so important that we can deny Chadians the opportunity to have a good life. And here what I would say is, well, think about how we handle this domestically, right? So there are people, Bill and Melinda Gates, have a lot more money than I, right? And we don't say, well, they've got so much money that if Kit wants to join their family, either make them a throuple, right, or maybe be a son, that I get to join their family. Instead, we say, okay, if there are duties of distributive justice, right, that the Gates family is welcome to exclude Kit as long as it makes the requisite transfers, right? I think we should do the same thing globally, right? So I'm not denying that there might be very stringent and demanding duties of global distributive justice. Whatever you think those duties are, what I would suggest is they don't have to be cashed out in the currency of open borders, right? So to put this, Michael Humer has an example in his argument in favor of open borders where he talks about starving Marvin, right? And if the fact that Marvin is starving gives Marvin's claim to enter the urgency, then feed him where he is, right? And so if the problem is that there are so few opportunities outside of Norway, right, one thing you can do, and again, I'm fine with this, is if the Norwegians want to open their borders and say, please come, right? But if they wanted to jealously protect their political self-determination, their political community, then it may be incumbent upon them to provide more opportunities elsewhere, right? This is what we do domestically. It seems like we should do this globally. Now, let me wrap up with one last example. One of the things that Ilya spoke about was refugees fleeing, right? And I think that there's no question, those of us who are very fortunate to be in well-oiled liberal democratic governments have a duty to provide refuge, right, to people who desperately need it. But again, I would point out that this refuge need not necessarily come in the form of open borders. Okay, so think about the way the US responded to 2 refugee crises in the 90s. So I come from St. Louis, where we have about 70,000 Bosnian Americans. And the reason is, in the 90s, with the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, there were Bosnians who were imperiled, and the United States said to them, come on, come into the United States. We actually have a lot of neighborhoods that you can inhabit in St. Louis. You can stay together. And so there's a largest Bosnian community outside of Bosnia in St. Louis, Missouri. Great. I got no problem with that. There's a second thing in the early 90s where there was credible evidence that Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime was going to use chemical warfare on the Kurds in northern Iraq. Now, if the United States on that occasion had said, we want to protect you, come here, immigrate to St. Louis, fine, I've got no problem with that. But they didn't. Instead, they said, you know what we're going to do? In collaboration with other countries, we're going to set up a safe haven with a no-fly zone in northern Iraq. In other words, we're going to give you refuge where you are, right? And what I want to suggest, I'm not suggesting one way is easier, one way is better. I'm just saying those were 2 very different ways of discharging the duty that the United States may have had to these refugees, which is to give them refuge. If you want to give them refuge in your own country and allow them to immigrate, great. If you don't, then you should do your fair share to make sure they have refuge elsewhere. And if you've done that, then no one can complain that you haven't discharged your duties. Thank you.
So, thanks to Kit for his insightful presentation. I'm allocated time for a brief rebuttal, which I will try to do. And I just need to talk about a couple of points that Kit raised. First, about legitimate states. I agree, legitimate states to protect human rights are better than other states that don't. But that doesn't follow that they have some special right of self-determination, because states are not entities with rights of their own like people are. Rather, they're just institutions that we use for particular purposes, like protecting human rights. So if it is protecting human rights and doing other good things, then we can pat the state on the back and say, great job, you're doing a great job, but it doesn't mean that it gains any kind of special rights. And I would especially add that one of the human rights it should protect is the right of freedom of association of the people who live there, which includes the right to associate with immigrants as well as with natives. That right of freedom of association should not be limited based on the ancestry or ethnicity or place of birth of the people involved. So if anything, a state becomes less legitimate and therefore should have fewer powers and rights once it starts imposing immigration restrictions, because that in itself undermines one of the human rights that the state ideally should be protecting. A second issue is that throughout parts of Kit's presentation, he analogizes states to voluntary organizations like families or universities and the like. And for the reasons I explained before, this analogy just doesn't work, because no existing state anywhere in the world is actually voluntary in the sense that it came about because all the people living in the area unanimously agreed to give it certain authority. Rather, if you look at the history of any state, including sadly the United States, it's an institution that arose through coercion, often without the consent of many of the people that it rules over. That doesn't necessarily mean the state is illegitimate. It may still be justified if it's protecting human rights and fulfilling other morally defensible functions, but it does mean that we cannot say that it has a freedom of association in the way that private individuals do or that truly voluntary organizations do, and this analogy does not hold. If it did hold, it have the dire consequences even for natives that I mentioned earlier. It's essentially a recipe for a totalitarian state, and I think that just doesn't work. Now, Kit suggests even if there is some duty to help migrants fleeing terrible conditions, maybe we can fulfill it in other ways. I would note that those other ways are vastly more difficult and problematic and likely to be less effective in many cases than simply opening borders. borders. Military intervention has obvious problems. I'm not against it in all instances, but it has obvious problems. Similarly, giving international aid, that one doesn't actually alleviate conditions of oppression. If anything, often that just gives more money to the very government that's doing the oppression in the first place. Moreover, the economics literature on the effects of aid is at best equivocal as to whether it actually can overcome problems of poverty, oppression, and the like, whereas we know, at least with a high degree of certainty, that simply letting people migrate freely does in fact make them vastly better off in all those respects. Finally, Kip makes this analogy between migration and sort of forcible annexation. I think that just doesn't hold, because when one nation annexes another, there is a power of coercion that the government exercises, and so that raises moral issues that merely letting people move around freely does not. An immigrant moving into the community doesn't by itself create the use of force against people. If that person commits a violent crime, by all means punish them, imprisonment and the like, but migration by itself does not do that, whereas by contrast, annexation inherently does. So the moral barriers to annexation should be, for that reason, greater than any barriers that might legitimately be set up against migration. More can be said, but for now I'll conclude, and I'll let Kit take the stage.
My mic still on? Super. All right, so we're here to disagree, and we do disagree. We have serious policy difference. I want to point out we agree on much more than we disagree. But there are two things on which we disagree, right? So I told you I've got three core premises. I told you the second, third, I was very confident about, I thought easy, and the first one was the more controversial. And that's what he disagrees with, right? He disagrees that political, even legitimate political states can be bearers of rights to political self-determination. I agree that's the most suspect of my three premises. But he's also right that what we should care about ultimately is persons, not states. Like him, I'm a value individualist. But remember my story about Sweden forcibly annexing Norway, right? I didn't say that if the Swedes did that, they would wrong Norway. I think they would wrong Norwegians. So I invite you to think about that. Do you think the Norwegians would be wronged if they were forcibly annexed by Sweden or by the European Union, right? In my view, I think that wrongly disrespects the Norwegians, because the Norwegians, insofar as they've collaborated on creating a legitimate political state, are entitled to political self-determination. So that's the value individualist story that I would tell, right? So if that seems plausible, you should be on Team Kit. If, on the other hand, you think, no, when the Swedes forcibly annex Norwegians, they don't wrong the Norwegians, then you should be on Team Ilya. Okay? I'll just stop there.
Time if you want.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have some pretty interesting differences on the table. At least the way that I see it is that there's agreement on when it's appropriate, say, or certain kinds of reasons to reduce or increase immigration restrictions. This sort of central issue is when it's legitimate for states to close borders and when it isn't. And I think one of the key issues here, obviously, is we've talked about the analogy between freedom of association and, say, the case of Norway and Sweden that Kit brought out. And I guess what I wanted to do was pose a question for Kit and a question for Ilya. One of the things that I'm curious about is that people are members of lots of different kinds of associations simultaneously. They're members of families and they're members of towns and cities and so on. So I'm curious, why is it the case that, for instance, being an association or an associate with Sweden would be the one that had kind of authority in this case? I mean, maybe your position doesn't suppose that, but it was one thing I was thinking of, because you do have freedom of association in lots of different ways.
I would just say this. So it doesn't apply only to states. I would say it also applies. Think about Augusta National Country Club. So very exclusive, and for a long time it had no women members, all right? And pressure was brought to bear on it to include women members. And I'm okay with it. I think given the gender inequities in our society, it might be that the presumptive right to self-determination of the Augusta members was outweighed by the importance of gender integration. But notice that still leaves room for there being a presumptive right. And it just boils down to this. When you're a member of a group, right, part of self-determination is determining what the self is, right? I'm not saying that country club membership is anywhere near as important as picking a marital spouse, right? They're not, that's an analogy, not an equivalence. But they are analogous because in both cases there's freedom of association involved. And what I hope the force of my argument is to point out that the same thing applies to political states, and there's a cost if you tell a political union that it may not control who is members of that political community. That's a deprivation of its self-determination, because with all groups, if they don't get to determine who the group is, there's a very important sense in which they're not self-determining.
Sure. Ilya, did you have a thought there?
Yeah, so my only thought is that I think this continues what I think is the unjustified conflation of voluntary organizations with coercive ones. So yes, the Augusta Country Club, I agree, has a presumptive right of freedom of association at least, and similarly, you know, obviously people should have the right to decide who they want to marry or not, but a state isn't like that, and indeed, if we analogize states to these voluntary organizations, you end up with horrible consequences for natives and not just immigrants. I would add that if you take this idea of letting political units have a freedom to exclude, then you can just as easily say, you know, Toledo should be able to exclude people migrating from Cleveland, or Ohio from Michigan, and so on. And you get right back to some of the rationales that were given for racial and ethnic segregation when, before the Civil War, in addition obviously to having slavery, there were some states that said even free blacks could not migrate here. Why? Because you know, that would be bad for the culture or the society in some ways or whatnot. And we reject these kinds of arguments in the domestic arena, both because the classifications are based on ancestry, place of birth, and the like, and other things which are morally arbitrary, but also because domestically we readily see the difference between the state of Ohio and the country club, and we should do the same thing internationally. We should recognize that these are two very different kinds of institutions, and that coercive institutions should not have the same kinds of rights of association as voluntary ones.
Kit, did you want to follow up?
No.
Oh, okay.
So another thing I was thinking about in your case, Ilya, was that I think there's oftentimes for very many people that there are at least a range of cases where the interests of groups might trump the interests of individuals, such that it would allow at least more immigration restrictions than what you were supposing. And I'm worried that someone might say that your form of individualism maybe is too sharp or too complete. That Kit's defending what he calls a value individualist position, but it looks like in your position you can't say something like there can be a pretty large city or even a group of a few thousand people. If they're not voluntarily constituted, their interests can't trump in a way that would justify coercion. Maybe I have the position wrong, but I take it that's, I think, what one worry might be.
Yeah. So obviously a lot depends exactly what kind of group interest you're talking about, but I would merely say that such a group cannot have a presumptive right to exclude merely because it is a group, and the reason why is because it's a coercive group, and therefore analogies to clubs and houses and the like don't hold. I do admit, and I said this in my presentation, that if there's some kind of dire, horrible consequences that can only be avoided by an immigration restriction, and there isn't a keyhole solution, or there isn't a way to tap the wealth to deal with it, then I can't exclude the possibility that there could be situations there where we would be justified in restriction, just as that also applies to internal freedom of movement. Like if somebody has a deadly contagious disease and the only way to contain its spread is to, at least for a time, to restrict their freedom of movement, then that might justify it and the like. But I don't think coercive groups have a general right of freedom of association association that gives them a right to bar migrants, and indeed, if they did have such a right because we were improperly analogized them to voluntary groups, then you end up with various kinds of problems of the kind I mentioned earlier. So I'm not a complete absolutist about this or any other right, really, but I do think the right to freedom of movement, and yes, freedom of association for natives, is an extremely important set of rights, and therefore can only be overcome by some kind of very weighty consideration that can't be dealt with otherwise.
So what do you think about Kit's Sweden-Norway case?
It's disanalogous for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that there's a difference between the imposition of a new coercive government, which has the right to do things like tax people, regulate people, and so on, versus just a migrant moving into the community, living there, working, interacting with people voluntarily. So it's just not the same thing.
Kit?
So good. So I think Ilyan's position is a sensible one. It's not the size of the group that matters, voluntary or not. And so it could be very large as long as it's not voluntary, but because political states are not voluntary. And just to emphasize this, right, nobody asked you before April 15th whether or not you'd like to pay your taxes. Right? You're told on April 15th to pay your taxes, and you're going to prison if you don't, right? So this is a non-voluntary, it's coercively imposed on us. And he's absolutely right that there's a jump from an individual and a voluntary group like Augusta National to something like Norway. No question about that. But if he's going to say that Norway is not a rights bearer, is not entitled to political self-determination, right, then I don't think he can explain why it has a right not to be taken over by Sweden. So Daniel Wellman is somebody who runs this line that, as argued in print, that because these are coercive institutions, they're not entitled to self-determination. But then he admits, and so therefore I'm fine biting what Kit considers a bullet, which is to say there's no right to political self-determination, and the Norwegians are not wronged and cannot complain if they're gobbled up in a larger union, which performs the functions better.
I would merely say that a lot depends on what the functions are and what it means to perform them better. But in principle, if you have a much more just state annexing a much less just state, then that might be morally justified, especially if it could be done peacefully and without massive destruction and coercion. So I'm happy to bite part of the bullet. That's totally fine. Nonetheless, I think as a general rule, people have a much stronger right to forestall the exercise of coercive authority over them, which is what government by its nature is, than merely to try to bar people from moving into the community, living peacefully, working, and so on.
So I think it was pretty interesting, just if I can bring out the bullet a little bit more. So you think that a just state could potentially annex a less just, or maybe substantially less just state, on the grounds that it would treat people more justly?
Yes.
That would suffice?
Yes, although remember the very important caveat of if there is a cost in terms of warfare and destruction and the like, then that cost could easily outweigh the improvement in justice. And so as a practical matter, I think in most cases, states, we should only resort to invasion and annexation when there's a really big difference in the justice. Like, if you believe that the U.S. is slightly more just than Canada or vice versa, that still is unlikely to justify the destruction and death that would come from the U.S. conquering Canada. On the other hand, if you take Kit's example of North Korea, if the U.S. could conquer North Korea and annex it at relatively little cost and in destruction and death, and the U.S. would almost certainly rule the territory better than the horrible dictatorship that there currently does, and I think that would be justified, though with the caveat that at this point it seems like it could only be done with horrible destruction and death, and therefore I wouldn't actually advocate this policy, but if it could be done a relatively little loss of life and destruction, then absolutely.
What do you think in that?
I think we're cooking with gas now,
Yeah.
because, we see the difference. So So he and I agree, right? If you've got an illegitimate state like North Korea, if you could, without disproportionate harm, go in and secure the human rights of the North Koreans, then neither the North Koreans nor the North Korean regime can object. We both agree about that. What we disagree about is whether you can do that with a legitimate state. So let's just stipulate that Sweden, if it annexed Norway, would do a better job than the Norwegians currently do. If your defense of legitimacy is just functional and there's no room for political self-determination, then the Norwegians can't object, right? It's just, in principle, there's nothing wrong with it. It would just depend upon the transition cost, how much damage would be done, and things like that. And so that's why I resist his position, right? The reason why I'm attracted to political self-determination is it seems like even if the Swedes could do a better job, it would wrong the Norwegians if the Norwegians didn't want to politically cooperate with the Swedes that way. Why are they entitled to that? Because they're already doing a satisfactory job of protecting the human rights, even if it would be better. I think this, just as I could go to, who am I in love with? Beyonce. I could go to Beyonce and I could say to her, look at all the ways in which your life would be better if you married me, right? And I might say this, right? I mean, don't you really want to be married to a moral philosopher? Wouldn't that be awesome? She's in a position to concede, yes, I'm not going to contest any of the ways in which, any of the factual claims. I just don't want to be married to you, right? And I don't get to say to her, right, you have to marry me because I would make your life better. She's entitled to reject me. And I think the Norwegians are equally entitled to reject the Swedes.
I guess we've sort of come full circle here. I would just remind people of the distinction I've already made ad nauseum between voluntary and coercive organizations. Forcing Beyonce to get married to someone who doesn't marry, even if it's as wonderful a person as Kit, is very different from dealing with coercive institutions like states. And if anything, it is in fact the coercive institution of the state that when it imposes immigration restrictions is preventing individuals from voluntarily associating with each other. I would add that to the extent that, in a certain sense, I've conceded that, if Sweden is more just than Norway, then it can annex Norway. And I agree, it could, even if Norway is doing a minimally decent job. The practical implication of that concession are minimal because it's a practical matter. It is almost never going to be the case that the forcible annexation of one liberal democracy by another will improve justice so much that it will outweigh the coercion and death and destruction that is caused. So I'm more than happy to bite the bullet of conceding this extremely limited set of cases that I didn't actually feel strongly about to begin with, and that I don't need to insist on to make my point anyway.
Well, I mean, I think it's still, at least to the level of principle, pretty interesting, because what I take Kit to be saying is that, and maybe even in the case with if there was a slight difference in justice, there's a moral sort of element there which says, no, you can't take us over just because you would be better, a little bit better, or even a fair amount better perhaps, because we're a nation or we're a people or something of that sort. And I understand your point that these maybe aren't just analogies, but I do think some people might have the intuition that that there's something moral missing, right?
So they do have the intuition. What I've tried to do, and obviously you can reject my argument if you want, I can't force you to accept it, but what I've tried to explain is that the intuitive analogy between a state and a voluntary organization is wrong because coercive organizations, which all existing states are fundamentally different, and if you reject the idea they're different, then there's other intuitions that you're going to undermine, such as the fact that it's wrong to have a totalitarian state that has the kinds of rights that a voluntary association might have over its property or over its members. But I admit, yes, there is an intuition the other way. All I can do is try to explain why that intuition, when you think about it more carefully, falls apart.
And then I take what Ilya is wanting to say is, perhaps there is some sort of maybe an interest or right of a group, but it wouldn't trump individual rights in cases where it's involuntary, or their associations is involuntary. And so he's stressing the disanalogies there. How might you sort of push back more directly?
So I can say two things. So I think that's very instructive. I can say two things. First of all, states if they're legitimate, satisfactorily protect the human rights of their constituents. So clearly a totalitarian state wouldn't qualify as legitimate, right? Because it's not respecting the rights of its constituents. And so I think I'm on solid ground there. But just as I pushed Ilya to concede, notice you are not embracing this premise about legitimate states being entitled to political self-determination. He can push me and say, okay, so you're fine with human rights and you agree that the states have to protect human rights. What about the right to freedom of movement? Freedom of movement is a right. It's a human right. Boom. States can't restrict it, and so they have to have open borders. What I would suggest there is, I will say, yes, freedom of movement is important. No, the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights weren't wrong to put freedom of movement on there. But what we need to do is we need to understand that when it qualifies as a human right, it's to sufficient freedom of movement, right? So I can't just barge into where Ilya is standing and say, freedom of movement, right? It's limited by the space that he's occupying. Or I can't walk into his home, go into his kitchen, open his fridge, and take a beer out and say, freedom of movement, right? Because it's limited by his property rights. So if I am, despite having a right to freedom of movement, right, I'm not at liberty to go onto Ilya's property without his permission, we shouldn't dismiss out of hand that my right to freedom of movement doesn't include the right to go into Norway's territory without its permission, right? And so I think that if I were contained in, obviously, someone's basement, my human right to freedom of movement would be violated. If I was told I wasn't allowed to go more than a 5-mile radius, my human right to freedom of movement would be violated, right? But if someone said, I live in St. Louis, if someone said, you're not allowed to go east of the Mississippi River, right? You can only go anywhere west of the Mississippi River in the United States. Be a bummer, be loads of places I'd like to go, but I don't think my human right to freedom of movement would be violated. Because I think in order for it to qualify as a human right, everybody understands it's got to be to sufficient freedom of movement.
All right, so I think we have two pretty clear positions on the table and some of the differences and different intuitions. And so I'd like to open things open to questions. I think we have some mics coming down on either side. Maybe about 20 minutes or so. Okay, they're coming down. Chris? Yep.
It's going to be about hairstyles.
Oh, no.
So thank you both. Thank all three of you. This is really great. Both of you appeal to libertarian doctrines for individuals or for states. And so I'm trying to find a way to break the stalemate, right? Where does the libertarian doctrine give privilege or priority, individuals or states? And I come to different ideas, but one I thought was, well, Aristotle, right? Aristotle's moral theory says the point of morality is to help the individual to flourish as best they can individually. And therefore, the purpose of the state is to set up institutions that help its members to flourish as best they can individually. So, this gives us, I think, an opportunity to see if we can break the libertarian stalemate. Which individuals should they prioritize first, the state or the individual, right? If our sort of aim is to help individuals flourish individually, we might put the state first by saying individuals are born into a state, they learn about who they are through the state, they're educated in the state, et cetera, so the state should be given primacy in how they flourish, and therefore the state's right to self-determination would allow them to justifiably exclude. Alternatively, the state is trying to serve people, maybe not its people, in which case the state's obligation is to help people flourish people. And so if we allow open immigration, we have more people, more innovation, bigger GDP, et cetera, like you were saying, Ilya, right? So if we think about how do we help people flourish? Does that give us a way to break the libertarian stalemate between prioritizing the liberties of individuals or prioritizing the self-determinative liberties of the state? Maybe it doesn't, but I was trying to find a way to get the libertarian position to break towards states or towards individuals, and I just thought Aristotle might be a fun way to do that. Maybe not, but
Yeah.
So let's leave, both of you have time to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I deny that there is a stalemate because not just on libertarian premises, but on any kind of liberal premises, it's individual human beings that have rights, and states are just institutions that are purely instrumental in nature. They're supposed to, among other things, help protect those rights, and therefore there's no such a thing as a state having primacy over individuals, at least not on liberal or libertarian premises. You have other ideologies like nationalism or something, or theocracy or whatnot, where maybe states should have primacy, but not in any kind of liberal libertarian point of view. In terms of human flourishing, obviously there are different theories of human flourishing. You could devote an entire whole other event to that subject. But if you believe that human flourishing has anything to do with increasing freedom, increasing economic growth, increasing scientific and technological progress, or saving lives, then a presumption of open borders can help you achieve that for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, and to the extent that there are downsides, they can be dealt with by some of the kinds of keyhole solutions that I mentioned, or by repurposing some of the wealth that migration generates. So I don't think there is any kind of stalemate here, at least not on liberal or libertarian premises. Whether you're a libertarian who mostly favors negative rights, or whether you're a welfare liberal who believes that there are positive rights to to assets and wealth and the like that the state should give to people in some cases, still you get more of both through a presumption of freedom of movement than you do by excluding people.
I don't want to speak for Ilya, but I didn't recognize anything distinctively libertarian in his argument. I think that all kinds of folks can plausibly deny that non-consensual groups are entitled to political self-determination. You don't need to be a libertarian to do that. Certainly Daniel Wellman, who's argued in this print, is not a libertarian. And I don't see that any of my three core premises is libertarian, although, and in fact, on my reading of libertarianism, they would be very skeptical of states at all, let alone rights to political self-determination. But let me try and take this on as a helpful suggestion. So what I suggested is that a state's legitimate if it satisfactorily protects the human rights of its constituents. That's a pretty standard political science conception of legitimacy. Let's swap that out for an Aristotelian one, which is to say a state is legitimate if it satisfactorily enables the flourishing of its constituents, right? And so if there's a state whose constituents aren't flourishing, we would say it's illegitimate, and one, if it were flourishing, would be legitimate. I'm not sure I'd be a statist if those are the rules, and I'm also not sure that I'm just unsure whether if we shift to that account of legitimacy, I'd be convinced that legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination.
All right, let's take more questions.
Forgive me if I kind of go all over the place. It's kind of a multifaceted question. But I think an element from this discussion that has been missing is the key part that broadly defined racial or ethnic identity plays into it, and I think our sort of conceptions of it. For example, the phrase self-determination has been sort of a hidden point for this debate, and especially with the history of the 20th century and sort of utilization of self-determination in an international liberal context. We think of like the creation of the state of Poland after the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and how various ethnic minorities from Germany and Austria sort of came together, lobbied for a state, and were granted that through international liberal institutions that were defined broadly on a majority ethnic Polish population, and that's sort of what defined the legitimacy of that state. So, given all that, if you got that, do all states have a right to self-determination, or is this right reserved for nation states with an ethnic majority? Additionally, can the United States, as a diverse representative state, be considered a nation state and doesn't possess a distinct right to freedom of association?
So,
Kit, did you want to?
So first of all, you're wrong. You're not all over the place. That was right on point. That was a great question. Okay. So in my view, being culturally distinct, there are other people who advocate the right to exclude based upon preserving the characteristics of a community, and those might be ethnic, they might be otherwise. That's not my view. My view is that you're entitled to you qualify for the right to political self-determination if you can perform the requisite political functions, okay? You can be any description and perform those right? So Icelanders and Tahitians are relatively uniform in groups. Canadians, Australians, and Americans are relatively multicultural. Right? What matters is not how we might slice and dice them. Are they performing the requisite political functions? And that's key. The second thing I would say is that everybody is entitled to human rights. Okay? Everybody is entitled to refuge. Right? So no one would be disqualified because they're culturally distinct or ethnically distinct or linguistically distinct, that they are no less entitled to their human rights. And if the only way you could satisfactorily secure their human rights is through immigration, right, then you have to do that. What I was trying to suggest in the main body of my comments is that's often not the case, right? And so imagine that there is a linguistically homogenous culture, right? And there are people in need that are elsewhere who speak a different language, or they're in some other way culturally distinct. In my view, if the culturally homogenous community doesn't want to incorporate them into the political community because of their differences, but can accommodate their human rights in some other way, then they're entitled to exclude them.
yeah. So Kit, as he's just eloquently outlined for you, has a theory of a right to exclude that does not depend on the race, ethnicity, or culture of the people doing the excluding. I knew that, which is why I only briefly mentioned this other approach in my opening introduction. But since you asked about it, I'll briefly explain why I reject ethnic or racial justifications for exclusion. It's kind of implicit in things I've already said. Think about why is it that we reject racial segregation domestically. It's because race or ethnicity are morally arbitrary characteristics, and it's wrong and unjust to restrict people's liberty based on them. And it's wrong even if you still have some freedom of movement or some freedom of association within the members of your own ethnic group or whatnot. And the same thing is true internationally, that it is unjust to have an exclusively Polish state or Japanese state or black state or white state for much the same reasons why it's unjust to do this domestically, because race and ethnicity is a morally arbitrary characteristic. It's something you cannot control. It's not something that determines how much freedom you're allowed to have. And I would add, of course, that the history of racial or ethnic exclusion, both domestically and internationally, is a horrible one filled with massive atrocities. And that, I think, is not an accidental attribute. It just was unfortunate that they went too far on a basically good premise. I think this is inherent when we start down the road of restricting people's liberty based on what race or ethnicity they are. Finally, I would note that if you look at the history of virtually every territory in the world, it's very difficult to take it back to a time where there was just one group living there and everybody else is somehow an interloper. If you look at Poland, Germany, England, to say nothing of the United States, we in fact have a constant history of intermixing. If you believe that the indigenous people are the ones who have the right to keep people out, well, who are the indigenous people of England? Is it the Anglo-Saxons, and therefore maybe able to keep out the Normans, right, or descendants of the Normans? But no, the Anglo-Saxons actually invaded and conquered the Britons. King Arthur, the origin of King Arthur arises from he was a Briton who resisted the Anglo-Saxon conquest. So you get these necessarily arbitrary lines that you end up drawing, and that's another reason not to start down this road.
Other questions? We have a few now. Good.
Yeah, so I just had a question about the sort of like coercive, voluntary group distinction, right? So I take it that kind of a lot's hanging on that, right? Because you're basically arguing that it's like coercive groups, so like the state, it doesn't follow that the state has like this right to self-determination, right? Because it's coercive. But I'm curious, like, so it seems like a lot of types of groups are kind of not clearly coercive or fully voluntary, right? So you might think like cultures or like religious groups are kind of like this, where there's a level of coercion, not in the same sense as the state or necessarily like violently imposed, but still costs imposed on like leaving a culture or leaving a religious group. So they're partially coercive, it seems, but also partially voluntary. And it kind of seems like the state could be like this, right? Because you have like a right to exit, if you're like a legitimate state, they grant a right to exit. And so it's like, it's not clear to me that this distinction is super like boundaried, I guess. And so I'm just curious, like, if we want to say things like cultures have a right to self-determination and they're kind of both sort of coercive and voluntary, how does that sort of play into the argument that states don't have a sort of right to self-determine if they're also kind of mixed?
I guess the question is primarily for me, since I'm waiting on this distinction. I would say first, even if there are some difficult cases where it's hard to determine whether it's coercive or voluntary, at the very least, states clearly fall in the coercive side of the line because they literally have police and prisons and so forth that like will shoot you or imprison you if they don't do what you say. Now, if it turns out that some other private sector institutions or seemingly private institutions are actually coercive, then that might justify limiting their right to exclude as well. And this is part of the argument for various kinds of anti-discrimination laws. I, being generally libertarian, even if not 100% so, would want to limit that. But if you think those private institutions are more coercive than I think they are, then the proper solution is to limit their right to exclude as well. And maybe that would justify the limitation on the Augusta Country Club example that Kit gave earlier, that if we don't limit the right of all male organization to exclude women, then like women's opportunities will be severely curtailed, or women will suffer severe injustice. Then, if the premise is right, then I would say, okay, fine, then we can do that. But I would not say, so if anything, pushing out to say, well, some of these other institutions are also coercive, to the extent that that's true, that might mean restricting their right to exclude as well, and we to some extent already do that with various kinds of anti-discrimination laws.
Do we have time for two more or one? One?
I just have a question.
Oh, okay.
Is that all right? Thank you. Yeah, so Michael Gonzalez with the Institute. I had a question for Ilya, actually. So it seemed like there were two principles, two foundational principles that I identified that would limit, or that would make borders unjust in your understanding. So on one hand, that states, because they're coercive entities, they can't be rights-bearing, and so they don't have a right to stake a claim, and set that aside. But then on the other hand, there was also this sort of, I could say in a kind of cheeky way, libertarian imperialism scenario where, well, the calculation comes out, and it turns out the net benefit is greater if Sweden does annex Norway, because Norway took a turn for the worse. So that second appeal, I think, would be an appeal that if there's just a net benefit, it's better off. Well, the populace on both sides is better off. So it appeals to human flourishing or welfare. I guess I was wondering is if there's a situation in which private associations, so it could be property, those sorts of distinctions get in the way of flourishing in the way that a border might, right? So it's a different kind of limitation, maybe voluntary. What would be the limiting principle that prevents dissolving those? So in other words, if there's no justification for having a border that prevents human beings across both sides from benefiting, then what's the principle that maintains we can have distinct property rights in a case of if that's unjust?
Yeah. So I would say two things. One is individuals have a presumptive right to liberty and property in a way that states don't, for reasons already discussed at length. But as I already mentioned previously in response to other questions, I do not claim that these or any other rights are completely absolute in all circumstances. So if it's either we limit some private organization's right to exclude people, or the world is destroyed or something like that, then of course I'd say let's limit it. But I think as a practical matter, though, such situations will rarely arise with purely private organizations. First, because in a given area there's competition between numerous private organizations. So even if you can't join the Augusta Country Club, there's likely to be other golf clubs or sporting clubs or whatever you can join. Even if this one employer won't have you even for a stupid reason, there are likely to be others. And unlike states, private organizations typically don't have monopolies over vast territories and the like, and therefore a private organization's right to exclude, while I cannot say that it can never cause such vast harm that we're justified in limiting it, I think it is unlikely under most real-world circumstances. But if I'm wrong about that, as I said in answer to a previous question, then the correct answer to that is simply to say, okay, fine, private organizations, or at least private organizations of some type, they should have less of a right to exclude than Ilya thinks that they should have. But almost any reason you can come up with for limiting the rights of private organization to exclude will also apply actually even more fully to the rights of states to do so.
Okay. Did you want to add anything?
I'm good.
More questions?
I think there are a couple.
Yeah, there's a couple around here, I think.
Thank you. So I'm trying to figure out how Native American tribes fit into this, because they are considered domestic dependent nations. And you have things like the Indian Child Welfare Act, which passed and recently upheld by the Supreme Court on the grounds of maintaining the status and membership of tribes. Tribes do, legally speaking, have the right to determine their membership. The United States government won't intervene in that. And so, I think the question could go to either of you, whether the tribes should be open to either members of other tribes coming in to the reservation land and sort of setting up shop, so to speak, or whether the tribes should have the right to exclude, and also maybe get the question of whether tribes should be considered legitimate states, because they don't have a lot of the features of other nations, but they are typically thought of, legally speaking, as nations, although again, domestic dependent nations.
Okay, and then Ilya?
Sure, a great question. I just can't answer it satisfactorily. But let me say a few things and invite you to push back. First of all, so my argument is about political self-determination, which, as I emphasized in response to that question, depends upon performing political functions, right? And so if Aboriginal Native American groups don't perform these political functions, then they're not entitled to self-determination. But you might make parallel arguments, and I think you very plausibly could, that they're entitled to cultural self-determination, and you would tell a parallel story. We might explain why they might have more rights to cultural preservation and exclusion on cultural grounds than others would. And then I think you also have all kinds of claims to reparations based upon the injustices that were perpetrated by states against these groups. So I'm open to there being all kinds of special claims, individual and collective, that Native American groups might have. It just doesn't follow automatically from the premises of my argument.
I'm not an expert on Native American tribes and tribal governments. I can only make sort of a limited answer, but I would say a couple of things. First of all, everything that I said about the injustice of racial and ethnic classification exclusions also applies to Native American tribes, and therefore, to the extent that these organizations have a kind of quasi-governmental coercive aspect, they too should not be allowed to exclude people based on race, ethnicity, and ancestry. That's despite the fact that there is a real and horrible history of injustice against Native Americans, and maybe some of those people are entitled to reparations if we can trace current horrible conditions that they face to these historic injustices. But that doesn't mean that they can create governmental entities that engage in racial or ethnic discrimination. And the Indian Child Welfare Act in particular strikes me as unjust, because what it essentially says is that when there is a child put up for adoption, if that child is of some kind of Native American ancestry, then it must be given to parents of that same ancestry, even if some other parents might actually be better from normal criteria of parenting. I think that's actually an injustice to the child and is wrong for the reasons that other kinds of racial and ethnic discrimination are wrong. So ultimately, I do not think that there should be, it follows from my argument, but also from basic moral premises of liberalism, that that we should not allow racial and ethnic distinctions in terms of rights to exclude or structures of government and the like. And I think that applies to Native American tribes no less than to other governmental institutions, notwithstanding the genuine and awful historic injustices that Native Americans have suffered, in part precisely because the U.S. government was engaging in various racial and ethnic discrimination and oppression against them.
I'd like to get in at least two more questions, because I think there were people waiting very patiently. I think it was here, and then, sir, did you have a question too? No? Okay, so then it was those two.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you could say more, I guess it's mainly to Kit, about sufficient freedom of movement. Because in your example, you mentioned, if you're living in St. Louis, it's not that you can't go to Mississippi, that's insufficient. So that makes it sound geographic, but in that sense, well, there's lots of stuff west of the Mississippi. Who cares about east of the Mississippi? But I take it the important part is something about sufficient freedom of movement to satisfy like other basic human rights, or have sufficient opportunity, but still, lots of that west of the Mississippi. And is there, so you might think, okay, there are states where these opportunities don't exist, there's like bad conditions, so you need sufficient freedom of movement to have those opportunities or access those conditions. But then it becomes unclear to me what state the individual has a claim on, right? So if individuals have to have sufficient freedom of movement, which state then has the obligation or which state's presumptive right to self-determination is overridden by this consideration?
Great. So there's two important elements, or two important questions there. So the first is, so you use this weasel word, sufficient. Would you spell that out? Sufficient for what? I understand human rights to be the protections that human beings in contemporary society need against the standard threats to living a minimally decent human life. Okay? That's why we care so much about human rights, and that's why we want to say that if governments aren't securing the conditions so their constituents can have minimally decent human lives, right, that we're going to come, as a matter of principle, can come in and help these people. Okay, so for me, it seems implausible to suggest, even let's suppose that I'm a ballerina, right? You wouldn't know it, by the way I shuffle around up here, but I'm a ballerina, and the only way I can get a job doing ballet is if I go to Moscow, right? So I desperately want to go to Moscow, right? That's the only place that will hire me to be a ballerina. I would love to go there. It'd be great if they admitted me, but I don't think it would be a violation of my human rights if Russia said, no, you may not come here, even though that's what you most want to do. Why? Because I think I've got the resources west of the Mississippi, right, to live a minimally decent human life, okay? So now that's not true. There are people in other countries, right, who don't have those types of opportunities, right? And that would be refugees, and they're going to have special rights. And then the second question is a humdinger, which is how do you pinpoint who is responsible for whom? And I can't. All I can say is that each of us has to do our fair share to try and rescue those people who are imperiled because their human rights aren't secure. right? And I do believe in the status quo is a moral abomination, and none of us probably is doing our fair share, right? But let's just go back to Norway. Let's imagine that Norway is suitably impressed by all of the people who are in desperate straits, right? And if they do their fair share, whether by allowing people to immigrate or helping them where they are, right, then that's all that can be asked of them. And if there's any given person who's still imperiled, right, she might regret it, but she doesn't have a claim to immigrate to Norway.
Do we have time for one more? Great.
Yes, so one thing I haven't Stephen brought up at this debate, and almost surprisingly, is I haven't heard anything about border security, what caveats we should use when letting immigrants, and so I'm just curious to see what caveats around border security would justify potentially closing the border.
So I think I sort of implicitly addressed this several times, that I said that if restrictions on freedom of movement are the only way to prevent some great evil, then you can do it. And similarly, there can be situations where restrictions are justified even within a country, like, if you have evidence that, this person is moving from one place to another to commit an act of terrorism and the like. So to fully cash out, you need a complete theory of when it's justified to restrict freedom of any kind or whatnot. And I think as a general rule, it's only justified, to prevent things like coercion, theft, the prevention of, vast harm, like the spread of deadly contagious disease, or like, but that goes to questions sort of about the broader political theory and not just immigration. My purpose in this debate is to say that there's no presumptive right of governments to restrict migration as such. It is not to say that the right of freedom of movement is a completely absolute right any more than I would say, any other right is completely. I don't think freedom of speech is a completely absolute right, or freedom of religion is a completely absolute right, and so forth. But I will say that the right of freedom of movement is a strong presumptive right, and it particularly should not be restricted based on ancestry, place of birth, race, ethnicity, and other similar morally arbitrary characteristics.
So I think that's a great question, and I think that the border control is about enforcing a moral right. I unapologetically defend the right of legitimate states to exclude outsiders, and I think every right may be proportionally enforced, but proportionality is important here, right? So this is my water right here, okay? And if you came up to take it, I think there'd be nothing wrong with my pushing or shoving you to try and protect this. But I can tell by the look of you, you've got the strength of 10 philosophers, right? And so I'm not going to be able to push you away, right? The only way I'm going to be able to effectively protect my water is to pull out my gun and shoot you, all right? May I shoot you? No, it's disproportionate. I think you forfeited your right against defensive force, but not that much force, because my right to this bottle of water is not that stringent. We can say similar things about the right to exclude outsiders. I think that legitimate states have a right to design and enforce their own immigration policies, right? And they may proportionately enforce that. And reasonable people can disagree about what's proportionate, but I don't think that anyone can reasonably defend the extents to which some states have gone to defend their rights, because they've gone to disproportionate measures, just as I would be going to disproportionate measures to shoot you to protect my water bottle, even though I'm not denying it's my water bottle.
Was there one thing?
Oh,
yeah. Sorry, no, I think we've one.
Hi. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sabina, and I'm a civic scholar in the Institute of American Constitution and Thought Manager. My question is for Kit, actually. So and I'll recommend both of your guys' speeches, but Kit, you mentioned that a solution to countries not wanting to, if they don't allow anyone coming in, is that a refugee camp. And Elliot, if I believe correctly, that you had mentioned that refugees tend to have some type of negative view. And just out of curiosity, I did kind of just do a general knowledge on Google. So the idea is that refugees are supposed to be a safe haven for people seeking it, but in reality, for individuals, they say they have challenges and risk, like sometimes there's no running water, no electricity, etc. So with this general knowledge, just giving like an example, if a woman, she had like say 2 children, and she was in this refugee camp, do you think, I know you can make a comment in the beginning that people, let's see, so it's a right, people don't have the right to be born, like decide where they're born. But do you think it's a right for that woman and her child and her 2 children, if she wants to seek refugee, because say if the refugee is like kind of like a bad place, give me the examples. So if she wanted to seek, say, America, would you still have that same belief?
Yes and no. So first of all, no one on this stage is defending the status quo, right? And when you look at the existing refugee camps, I think they're utterly indefensible because of the deplorability of the conditions and the duration in which people are contained there. That's simply not, we're just not doing our share to provide satisfactory refuge, right? So the 2 examples I gave in the 90s is when the United States invited the Bosnians to immigrate and come, and they protected the Kurds where they were, okay? And so let me give you an example of a country that, let's just take your mother with 2 children, okay? Suppose she is in northern Iraq, right? And she's just not secure there, and she needs to go somewhere. I have no objection to Norway saying, please come here, please immigrate here. If the Norwegians say, no, we really prefer not to include these immigrants, then the Norwegians may have a responsibility to make sure she gets refuge elsewhere. I have no problem with a temporary camp if it's temporary, if it's genuinely temporary, and because we think we can fix the conditions which require the refuge, and the conditions in the camp are satisfactory. But let's stipulate, with your question, that the camp is simply not, right? I also have no problem if Norway goes to Turkey and says, if we give you resources, will you allow these people to immigrate? And if the refugees can be satisfactorily accommodated in Turkey, and they're willing to do so only because Turkey's getting transfers from Norway, also have no problem with that. If there's no way for us to make sure that this poor woman and her children has adequate refuge outside of Norway, then I agree, Norway's got to let them in.
Okay, we're at 8:30. I think that's when we were going to, oh, well, yeah. Okay.
I certainly think this is an interesting topic, especially for what's going on in the world today internationally. But I think one topic one conflict that kind of reminds me of this immigration open and closes. It's a very controversial topic, but the Israel-Palestine. Because one side could say, the Israeli side could say that they want to perpetuate a Jewish state, whereas the Palestinian side would want to say that, like I said, I'm not defending actions of Hamas or the IDF. It's a very complicated issue. But do you think the Palestinians have a right to, more or less, we've been debating, and also the Israelis, do you think they have a right to perpetuate their society?
Yeah. So obviously you could have a whole separate event on this if you wanted to. I would merely say that I don't think there's an inherent right to have a Palestinian majority state or a Jewish majority state. To the contrary, both would be forms of ethnic or racial discrimination that are wrong for the reason I mentioned earlier. However, as between these 2 flawed contenders, I think the Israelis overall are a much more liberal and much less oppressive society than the other one. So if I had to choose, should the Israeli government rule a given territory or should Hamas rule it, I think the Israeli government is obviously better, even though it has many serious flaws, and even though merely being less bad than Hamas, that's actually not a, that can't be the sole standard by which we judge people. That doesn't exhaust all of the issues arising in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I would just, and I can't possibly do so in like the 30 seconds that I have here, I will merely say that I do not exclude this situation from my general principles that states should be judged based on their protection for human rights and promotion of human human welfare, and that states generally do not have a right to restrict people based on race or ethnicity.
I don't have anything distinctive or distinctively valuable to say about that heartbreaking situation.
Any other questions? Well, we managed to have a civil discussion and debate. We're very grateful that you came out. Let's thank our speakers.
Thank you all.
And thanks to all of you for coming to our event at the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. These are events that we do several times a semester, and we will continue to do them on lots of different topics. And, so thanks so much for being a part of what we're trying to do here at the University of Toledo.
Thanks, man. It's good.